Thank you, everyone. I'm really incredibly honored to moderate this panel highlighting one of our tech transfer community successes. Every day we go into the office, and some days we seem to be slogging through matters of institutional policy, matters that include long meetings, overflowing inboxes. I bet you all have some of that going on right now, just like me. We are so fortunate, though, when our work reaches the world in a meaningful way. For many years, Autumn's Better World Project has told the stories of impactful tech transfer in ways that make tech transfer and knowledge exchange accessible to public understanding. Additionally, these stories inspire creative ways we can work together within our ecosystem and advocate for new and improved sources of research funding, a strong and reliable patent system, and predictable and stable government policies that encourage startup formation and commercial use of those innovations. And now for some more audience interaction. I bet you guys are really excited about this part. Clear your laps. We're gonna have some more standing. You guys have been sitting too long, obviously. If you've been a member of the Better World Project Committee, please stand. I know there's a lot of you in the audience right now. If you're a member currently of any committee on Autumn, please stand. This is a volunteer-led organization. Look at all of this participation. This is wonderful. Stay standing, stay standing. And if you've made it all the way to the end of the Autumn Annual Meeting and are at the Wednesday Plenary, please stand and give yourself a round of applause. Okay, you may be seated. Kind of felt good to stand up, didn't it? So it's these stories and these people that make what we do meaningful, powerful, and inspirational. Today, we want to highlight one of our success stories, where everyone from PIs to tech transfer staff, regulatory stakeholders, an emerging pharma company, a big pharma, and of course, patients and patient families, they've all worked collaboratively together to save lives. The story we're going to tell you is about spinal muscular atrophy, or SMA as it is known. 1 in every 6,000 babies is born with SMA. It's one of the most prevalent genetic disorders affecting young children and a major cause of death in infancy. Or it was. Today's panel is going to share their story of a scientist's relentless pursuit for a cure with the support of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories, the tech transfer office there, and a partnership with Ionis Pharmaceuticals. To start, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Adrian Craner, a biochemist recognized for his work on RNA splicing and the development of mechanism-based therapeutic applications. In spinal muscular atrophy, a gene called SMN2 is spliced incorrectly, making it only partly functional. The Craner lab found a way to correct this defect using a powerful therapeutic approach, which led to the creation of Spinraza, the first FDA-approved drug to treat SMA. Next, please help me welcome Andrew Whiteley, Vice President of Business Development and Technology Transfer at Cold Spring Harbor Labs. Andrew's broad experience in commercializing life science technologies supports the commercial spin-outs from Cold Spring, including Spinraza. He serves new companies in roles ranging from director to mentor to consultant on issues related to business strategy, fundraising, and org development. Representing the pharma side of our discussion, please help me welcome Frank Bennett. He is the Executive Vice President and Chief Scientific Officer at Ionis Pharmaceuticals and one of the founding members of the company. He's responsible for continuing to advance Ionis technology and expanding the company's discovery platform. He's also the franchise leader for gene editing programs at Ionis. Hey, Frank. And finally, I would like to invite the Camp family to the stage. Amanda and Jeremy Camp are here with their children, including son Asher, who was diagnosed with SMA type 1 at just 6 months of age. Just 1 week after his diagnosis, Asher was approved for the phase 2 clinical trial of Spinraza and continues to receive treatment today. All right, thank you all for being here on the panel. We're going to start with some questions to more fully understand the disease itself. So Dr. Craner, I'd like to start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about the disease and what inspired you to find a cure?
Yes. So SMA, or spinal muscular atrophy, is a neurodegenerative disease. It's genetic, as you mentioned, and it affects approximately 1 in 6,000 to 10,000 newborns, and about half of them have the most severe form, type 1 SMA. That used to be the leading genetic killer of infants. So the patients would not be expected before therapies were developed to survive more than 1 or 2 years, or if they did, they would require permanent ventilation and they would be essentially paralyzed. And the reason my lab started working on this disease in 2000 is because the previous year I attended a meeting at the NIH, a small meeting on this disease, and it was presented there that there was an underlying defect in RNA splicing, which is the basic process that my lab studies. And so that motivated us to start working specifically on SMA, first to understand some mechanistic basis of a gene defect, and later to try to come up with a potential therapy with our collaborators.
Can you tell us a little bit about how the therapy actually works? What is it? How is it delivered?
Yeah.
How often do patients get it?
Yeah, so the drug that we developed is called Spinraza, and it's an antisense oligonucleotide, or ASO. So it's a small strand of nucleic acid, and its sequence directs it to bind to a particular RNA in the cell nucleus, the RNA made from the gene SMN2. And so when it binds to that RNA at a precise position, it blocks the binding of a splicing regulator, a protein that functions as a splicing repressor. So by preventing the binding of the repressor, the drug enables the SMN2 gene to produce more of the protein, SMN, which is essential for motor neurons in the spinal cord to survive. And so the way the drug is delivered is by lumbar puncture, and 3 times a year is how often the patients need to receive it because it lasts for a long time in the central nervous system.
That is really cool. And tell me a little bit about the state of the art when you first made this discovery. I was reading a lot many years ago about oligotherapies, siRNA, et cetera, and they seemed kind of stalled. And then Spinraza jumps on the scene and makes this huge impact.
Yeah, it's true. I think that so antisense technology was first described in 1978, I think. So there was excitement, there were a lot of difficulties along the way, and there were some drugs already approved from Ionis, but there was some skepticism about how far the technology could continue to advance. And then RNAi, siRNAs, that was a new development, so the excitement shifted in that direction, but it also was not such an easy path. And I think Spinraza really revitalized interest in this technology, in particular because of its effectiveness in neurology, so in the central nervous system and its long duration of action, and really the efficacy that it had in SMA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really great gift that we have Asher with us today. Camp family, Amanda or Jeremy, could you tell us a little bit about how you ever heard of SMA. Had you ever heard of SMA before you had Asher?
No, we never heard of SMA. I had had 2 girls prior to Asher, and all my pregnancies and deliveries were healthy. They were all healthy after birth. We had no family history of any, medical issues that we knew of. I had opted out of genetic testing with the pregnancies. I just thought, oh, I don't need that, not knowing what I know today, and had no idea about SMA at all, and there was no family history that we knew of.
Tell us about how you got involved with the clinical trial and how that process worked. I heard you were really tight on the deadline getting in.
Our story, it all happened so fast. We got the diagnosis the same day. Dr. Richard Finkel at Nemours Children's Hospital in Kissimmee, Florida, reached out to us. We didn't even have the mindset to think, what are our options? We were told there were none. Take your baby home and love on the boy. But we're grateful for these folks, especially Dr. Richard Finkel, one of my personal heroes, but he found us. We're so fortunate for that.
And it was through a network of sorts. Asher, like I mentioned earlier, he was born healthy, everything was fine, but around 4 months old, we definitely could tell something was off. And we thankfully had a phenomenal pediatrician who listened to us, and he expedited everything, so we ended up at a neurologist's office, and we were in Florida at the time, and the neurologist didn't know anything about SMA and literally handed us a Wikipedia page, of which we were just kind of dumbfounded, and we were told the prognosis that he probably wouldn't make it to his 2nd birthday, but
He'll be 11 next month.
yeah.
So.
What a miracle and what a miraculous story. These stories are so kind of long in the making and long in the coming. So we heard from Adrian about the original discovery. Frank, how did you and Dr. Craner get to know one another, and how did your paths converge?
Yeah, so I've been working at a company that was developing this antisense technology, and I've been working at the company for 14 or 15 years at the time. And we've been looking at a variety of different therapeutic applications for the technology, and really had just started a burgeoning effort in neurodegenerative diseases. And Dr. Craner published a paper that was in a high-profile scientific journal, and it caught my attention because he was using a technology that we had the commercial rights to, and the application of the technology was, fitting in very closely to where we were heading as far as in our research labs. And so I contacted Adrian and, suggested that we have a chat and figure out whether we could collaborate with each other and really take his, fabulous findings and try to translate them to patients like Asher. And so that was 20 years ago, and it's been roughly 20 years of a wonderful partnership between the two of us.
That's incredible. Speaking of time, time passes, and it takes so much time and an investment of time, and we're always looking toward the future. My question is for Asher now. Asher, can you tell us a little bit about what you have in mind for your future? What are your future plans?
Well, I want to be a video game maker.
A video game maker. Ooh.
So that
I think Asher, you should have been at our AI panel a couple of days ago.
so that kids like me can play video games. Like my friends can play video games. Like everyone in the world could just play the games I make. And
That is so cool.
I could just like them and yeah.
I love it. Do you ever tell your friends about this great science that you've been involved in and the courage of your family to trust in this clinical trial? you ever explain about that to them, or what do they think?
Not really.
Not really? You don't have to, right? Because you're just a kid,
Complicated.
living a kid's dream. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
But
So next I'm going to turn to Andrew and ask about this connection and collaboration between Cold Spring Harbor and IONIS. We all know that the early part of the collaboration is super important in the development, but so are the later stages of that collaboration. Can you tell us from your perspective why you think this was so successful? What contributed to the success of this project?
You know, there are three things here: patience and diligence and tenacity of these two gentlemen working together over 10 years to actually formulate and knock down all of the problems that there were to finding a way that you could treat Asher, and this amazing outcome, being able to sit here today, it's an honor for me. I've come into this very late in the process. So 20 years ago, I was not working at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, but John Moroney, who was my predecessor at that time, signed a simple collaboration agreement between the institution and IONIS that set in train many additional agreements later, not just in Adrian's work, but in other academics' work as well. So that type of effort over such a long period of time is something we have to think about all of the time in our office, because we have to be in this for the long haul if we're going to be able to deliver on the technology that we're seeking disclosures around and looking to try and develop. So patience and tenacity are two big things.
Yeah, excellent. What is the future like for those collaborations that Cold Spring Harbor is hoping to spark here for this case? Is there new technology coming down the pike, or are there new applications to the existing tech that you're helping with?
So our relationship with IONIS continues to this day. I have a meeting with the company tomorrow because we still have additional projects that we're working together on. Some of them are winning, some of them are not winning. You never know which ones are going to be successful. But it does mean that you have to establish relationships between academic institutions and industry that are sustainable through the good times and the bad times to get to where we need to be. The eventual outcome of all of this is a successful commercialization, which means that some of that value comes back to Cold Spring Harbor Labs and allows us to reinvest in further science and further applications that will go to the next generation of therapy. So whilst I came in at the very end of it, we continue the story even today, after such a long period of time when we started, when the company was just a small entity in those days.
And I did recently learn that there's some very exciting news on the diagnostics front for SMA. Many of us think of these great therapies and these stories about the great therapies that are there, but the first stage in, and even before we start developing therapies, is just recognizing the existence of a particular disease, and diagnostics are a really critical part of that whole process. So there is now SMA screening for all 50 states in the United States, and when babies get treated earlier, there's a chance for much, much better outcomes. Dr. Craner, could you comment on the impact that that's going to have for us?
Yeah, I don't think I could overstate how critical that advance was. It took a number of years to implement newborn screening in all the U.S. states. So finally this year, they've reached 100% of newborns being screened. So the type 1 SMA in particular is the earliest onset, but for several weeks to months, the symptoms are not evident. And meanwhile, a lot of the motor neurons are dying. And so if one gets a genetic diagnosis, then treatment can begin almost immediately. I'm talking in infants a few days old. And so there was a clinical trial done like that. It was called Nurture, that Biogen sponsored, and it showed that those infants, because they were treated so early, they essentially weren't getting the expected symptoms of the disease as they grew older, and that's already been 5 years. And so you see patients that are genetically diagnosed with type 1 SMA, but they learn to walk normally and they develop normally thanks to the ability to treat almost immediately. So that's extremely important, great development. And Taiwan, for example, also has mandatory newborn screening, but it hasn't been implemented everywhere, so it's important that other countries follow this example as well.
Yeah, it's amazing. It was amazing to me as I was preparing for this that, the statistic, 1 in 6,000 babies are impacted by this, yet no one that I knew had ever really heard of SMA, unless you're in that field. So the power of screening and knowing is going to make just a tremendous difference in these patients' lives, as is like the doubling up of therapies. Frank, we were talking before about some new therapies that are coming down the pike with gene therapy and some others, and the possibility of combination therapies. Can you make any comments about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 other drugs that have subsequently been approved in the U.S. One is a gene therapy product that's using adeno-associated virus to deliver the gene that's missing, the SMN gene. That was approved, I think, in 2019, roughly. And then there's a small molecule drug that behaves very similar to Spinraza that modulates the splicing of SMN2 that was approved a year or so later. And so we have 3 drugs now that are available to patients, and it's an important discussion to have with the physician. What's the right medicine for the patient and the family? Where hopefully we'll get to is thinking about combination therapy. Right now, these are expensive medicines, and so that's a hurdle for thinking about combination. But just like a lot of other diseases, I really do think that that's a direction where we have to go. There's some early clinical trials that are being done to begin to explore combinations of these 3 drugs, and they look very promising from what's the available data that's out there yet.
Yeah, so the research continues. That the research and the discovery is such an integral part of the process, and making improvements and continuing
And I
to
should
advance.
say, I should have added that we are, continuing to look at medicines that maybe will be easier for the patient. So Spinraza, you have to administer it by intrathecal injection every 4 months. We have identified a follow-on compound that you may have to dose once a year. And so it's still very early in that process, but it does show that innovation is going to continue to improve patients' lives.
Yeah. Amanda, you were sharing earlier about how Asher has grown in his treatment compliance or treatment journey.
Yeah.
Can you share a little bit about that?
Well, when Asher was first treated, he was kind of just like a big baby blob. I mean, he didn't move much. Like I mentioned earlier, he hadn't reached certain infant milestones, and then by the time he got his loading doses, his legs barely moved. Couldn't sustain any pressure really or support. And after his loading doses, it was I think within a month he started lifting his legs, and then he was a little over a year old. His birthday's in March, and it was in April, and he could sit unassisted for just a few seconds. So as we started, going regularly for treatments, he used to be awake as a baby, but then he started getting too strong and realizing, wait a second, I'm this baby being held down to stick a needle in my back. So it got a little stressful for us and the doctors. So we agreed to start putting him under anesthesia. And as Asher got older, we were actually kind of more concerned almost about the anesthesia than we were the actual drug at that point. And we had talked with Asher about the future and, eventually not being sedated when he when he got treatment, and he had made an agreement with us because we tried to practice, autonomy, and this is a lot for a child to go through, and every step of the way we're always discussing what are we doing next, and what does he want, and it's his body and all that kind of stuff. And he had told us, I think he was around 8, that when he was 10 years old, that he would stop going under anesthesia. So we were like, okay. So as 10 years approached, he said, okay. So that was last year, and he had close to, I think, 30 doses by that point, and more than 20 had been under anesthesia. And then he ended up going in for his first dose without anesthesia, just the local numbing, and he did great. But his favorite part about it, I think he should share.
Asher, what's your favorite part?
VR goggles.
VR, wow. I'm seeing some technology discovery in your future.
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
some VR games to help patients sit still while they undergo procedures
Yeah.
with eye movement or something
That
like
wouldn't
that.
work. No.
It wouldn't work?
That wouldn't work.
Oh man, shut down.
No, because they would just be like going around, moving around, and while they're trying to like.
Oh, well, maybe it's a game where you try to hold your eyes really still at a point or a spot. Maybe that would work. And
That would probably be too boring.
Challenge
All right.
accepted.
Well, the other thing I think that's really important in this story or in any kind of a chronic and really severe disease like this are patient advocacy groups and other families and the support that they give you in talking through the history of their journeys. Can you share with us about any of the support groups that you all use or the impact that they've had on you or how you've helped others?
Well, sure. I mean, first of all, when he was diagnosed, it was crazy because nobody knew anything at the time, and even the first neurologist that we went to didn't know anything, and that connection, from earlier, I just wanted to mention that thankfully he had reached out to Dr. Finkel, which was in another city in Florida at the time because we lived in Florida, and when we started just uncovering the disease and then this clinical trial, the first thing I did was start scouring the web and everything was so sad. It made you cry because there was no hope. But then I had never been on social media before. So we had found a family actually through a blog that was only 30 minutes away. And that family was like basically kind of like the pivot point for us, where we not only got connected to the bigger community of SMA, but we got to see firsthand the potential future of the devastation of the disease, because that child was about 5 years old when we met them, and she could barely eat and pick up a fork, and she was so weak, and her body had atrophied so much. But when we walked into that house, that same little girl that was eating before us, atrophied and weak, had all newborn pictures and toddler pictures that were healthy. I mean, she was diagnosed type 2, so she was even stronger than Asher, and the disease had just progressed so bad. So we got that first glimpse through families, connecting with other families, and then ultimately, I think our biggest support has been through Cure SMA. That organization has been phenomenal for, sending care packages and sending information and advocating for newborn screening. I mean, because of Cure SMA, our family helped Florida become a newborn screening state, and just that sort of thing. And then the education that they take back and feedback from families and kind of share with everyone else, I think has been a phenomenal bridge in our journey.
Yeah.
I think it's worth saying also, just to acknowledge that there was some crucial early stage funding from a couple of the foundations that backed Adrian's work. I mean, we didn't have easy access to sort of translational funds, and these foundations, stepped up and were able to provide critical funding at the time when it was really needed. So that was SMAF, and the Muscular Dystrophy Foundation also provided some funding as well.
And I would also just highlight that the foundations also were very helpful in us thinking through the clinical development of the drug. And through the foundation, we met Dr. Finkel and engaged Dr. Finkel to help advise us in how to do a clinical study and what to measure in the patients. And I think the foundations probably belong on the stage as well, because they were central to this whole exercise.
We did try to get them on the stage. Brooke worked really hard, but they couldn't make it today.
I wanted to say that thanks to the foundation, for instance, Cure SMA has an annual meeting that's super important. So I've been attending that since 2000 when we started working on it. So that brings together patients and families, researchers and clinicians, and industry later once the drugs were coming into play. So these interactions are super important to advance the science and the translational research.
So this is a first-in-class approach, and when I think about this panel and the village of people that we have with all different portions of the story, and any one piece of that, if it was missing, this success would not have happened. When you think about that village that's needed, is there any, if you could advise us in this room, is there any one role that was specifically difficult for you that you wished there was more of, or that you stumbled upon to make it work and make it fit? Anybody? Frank?
Yeah, no, it's, I think, this project is sort of the poster child of how things should work. And we had a very good relationship with the Cold Spring Harbor Labs. We had a good relationship with the foundations. And, as a pharmaceutical company, we have to be a little bit careful for, interacting with patients when we're doing drug studies. So we sort of use the Families of SMA or Cure SMA organization to help mediate between us and the families. And so, I think this one example is really a very visible success story. I really can't identify anything that would have made it better was missing. The regulatory agencies were very engaged in the process, and they were regulatory agencies, so they don't do everything you want them to do. But they actually wanted the drug to succeed, and so they advised us and helped us, bring the drug to patients as quickly as possible.
I would say that was probably the hardest thing that we didn't expect as being trial participants, was realizing not very far into it how fortunate we were, because we were seeing the drug work, and we were in a phase that didn't have a placebo. So we knew Asher was getting the drug, but while he slowly improved, we started having families reach out to us that were having children that were getting weaker, and they wanted to know how do we get the drug. And so in that time frame, just watching everybody work as diligently as possible, and I don't know much about this world, but the drug getting fast-tracked, going through all those phases of realizing the efficacy of it early on. And I mean, it was a tremendous victory. So I think it really was kind of like this exceptional, amazing opportunity to be a part of, because we didn't even realize it was going to work as well as it did, and not just as a drug being administered, but the whole process of it.
I mean, if there's one thing that just reminded me, the hardest thing was doing a placebo-controlled trial.
Yeah.
We had been getting anecdotes, Asher specifically, and other patients like Asher that were doing better. Yet we had to do a pivotal trial where there was a placebo, or it was a sham group, but they weren't getting the drug. And to me, emotionally, that was the hardest thing I've ever had to do.
Yeah.
But the FDA required that, and one can argue that because of that control being done, the results were unambiguous, and therefore that led to faster approval than it might have otherwise.
Yeah, Adrian's absolutely right. Without the control, there was always second guessing whether the benefits that we're seeing is just natural history or individual variants. But
and even it was really interesting because I mean, there's the science world of it, and then even as a family, I remember early on, because again, we weren't on social media or anything, but then we started sharing our story, and it was already a little ways into him being treated, and we even had families say, "Oh, well, Asher's not a real type 1." And we were like, well, what? We hadn't even been in our journey long enough to even understand, like, what do you mean? I mean, we had read about it, but then we started meeting families. Yeah, they were already trach dependent, and they couldn't move, and they weren't in wheelchairs sitting up. And I mean, our first conference, when we started meeting families, Asher reached his arms up, and this other dad just started crying because that's not what type 1s, did. So it was a big deal to see all this happening, like in the science world, and like how it was even affecting like our community and the change that it was seeing.
I think these gentlemen here are all very cute. We, as a parent, we need more people like these guys, more people like you guys.
So that was the past. Now let's switch to our future. So I'm going to go down the line here and ask you all about your plans for the future. I'll start here.
Well, the future is already the present. We're working on other diseases where we think that similar technology can be applied. For instance, we're working on some pediatric brain cancers that currently have no available treatments. So we think that there's a lot of potential to use this technology and apply it in different ways for different diseases.
And you?
And so it's a full-time job. Yeah. So Adrian and I meet, quite often to advance each one of these programs. Each one has its own nuances, and it's probably worth just being a little bit geeky about the science. This was not just a simple structure that was developed. There's a whole set of componentry that was described in the joint patent applications that we had between Cold Spring Harbor and with Ionis. And it's not just the structure. There's stabilization of the RNA molecule and the chemistry involved in that, and the dosing. This idea of actually dosing a drug into a spinal cord was something that had not been done at that point. So it just shows that you've got to be engaged in a long-term process and just knock down many problems. And we have aim at some of these other rare diseases and thinking about other issues that will come up to actually being successful in that endeavor. So it's a big team effort.
Yeah. How about you, Frank?
yeah, so we're continuing to work on applying the same technology that was used for Spinraza for other severe neurological diseases, and unfortunately there's no shortage of neurological diseases to work on. We recently had some success where we had a drug for a genetic form of ALS that was approved by the FDA, but we're continuing to work on both other diseases, but as I mentioned, we're continuing to work on improving the therapy, and are hopeful at some point we won't have to do the spinal tap with the technology. I think that's in the future at some point.
That's awesome.
Well, the fact that there is a future that we're talking about, they've turned this whole disease on its head. Asher's diagnosed type 1, the most severe, and we've yet to even experience a plateau because of Spinraza. He continues to make gains. I hesitate to say quality of life, but just the improvement with his physical abilities it still takes us aback with each dose. It's incredible.
Yeah, and our there's been a big shift. I mean, it's kind of been evolving for a while, but when you're given such a devastating diagnosis as a parent, you just kind of go into like this black cloud, dark cave. You know, it's just like, oh. And even with this idea of a treatment and everything, I mean, it was just like, you can stop crying, you know, you could barely get out of bed. It was just really hard, and it still is. I mean, there are still days like that, and a lot of families are going to experience that when they have that kind of experience. But I think the shift that's really happened is going from almost like just survival mode, like how do we just live? How do we just make it through the day? And we definitely give ourselves grace for that. But it's more like, oh, okay, like how do we live? Like, what do we do? And a big thing that we really try to do is connect with adults with SMA that have like pushed barriers long before treatments were available, and really kind of press those barriers of like, so what, it's not accessible, we'll make it accessible, and just kind of like pushing that envelope of what can we do. And it's a weird thing, like just even coming to speak, it's really a big deal to us because it means so much, but it's almost at this point we're like, oh, well, we did the trial, we're done and over, like we did our part, you know, kind of. So it's like we'll be forgotten. Not that we need to be recognized, but just like it's this weird thing that we've gone past this big thing. But I forget that we're not past it. I mean, every day it's a big thing for us, whether it is for anybody else. And it's just a great opportunity when we get to share that, especially a new family that, I mean, again, when you read something, it's so different than when you see it live, like living or experience it. So to be able to see hope in the flesh is so different than hearing or being told that there's hope. And so we get a chance to like really like share our story, I think is what we want to contribute to the future, you know, those families in the future.
So every year at the Cure SMA conference, one of the biggest draws for the children is the wheelchair race. There's a wheelchair race between the kiddos and the researchers. And
We always lose.
Yeah.
somehow the researchers always lose. But for the past 3 years, there's been children running in those races. And that's unbelievable.
Yeah.
We all in this room understand the importance of team and our place in a bigger team and a team effort. Could anyone here share the special qualities of their team that has really inspired you or contributed to this story? Anybody has some good team stories to share? Dr. Finkelstein?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's for Asher that I think that it really did pull together a very large team. There were probably at least 100 people that touched Spinraza, in its development, and it was seeing what the potential of the drug could be that brought everybody together. And people work a lot of late nights and weekends to keep the project going forward. Starting at the research side and going all the way through to ultimately the commercialization of the drug. And it's really families like the camps that keep us going every day.
Yeah. I have to say something that's just try to get through this, but seeing families that lost children years ago and still stayed active in the community with foundations, continue to raise money to support research and push forward development and science, and to just, I mean, Dr. Hanna said, it was 13 years before Asher got his first dose, and he had been already working on it 13 years. So the doctors that stay in it, it's just all these moving parts, but those that really stay in it, sometimes you just wonder, like in your lifetime, will you make a change? Will you see it? And I remember when we met with Dr. Finkel, even on the phone, the first phone call, this was a man who had dedicated his life to pediatric neurology. He had seen thousands of babies die at that point. And he said, but we think this drug is going to change things. I mean, just that alone was just amazing, that a doctor, would stay in the field that long, treating patients and working to push for a change in the future and bring hope to families like ours. So that's definitely a huge thing for us.
Well, we've left a bunch of time at the end here for questions from the audience. If you have a question for the team up here, please make your way to the microphones in the room. It's very hard to see, so you'll just have to sort of start talking. Oh, now I can see better. They've turned on the lights.
My question is to Asher. Asher, we've talked this morning a lot about your gaming, and you just mentioned it, but what is one of your favorite things to do?
Video games, swimming, basically a lot of stuff kids like to do. Coding, like creating my own games, kinda. Playing board games and card games. Swimming.
That's a lot of stuff, Asher. Good job.
Thank you for an amazing presentation and for sharing your journey with us. I wanted to have just your thoughts of what happened with the people who are in the control and they're receiving placebo. And also if you have shared your journey with other diseases that also trying to make a difference. I'm very familiar with the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation. Out of a case of a good friend who has a daughter that has the disease. So if you can share some of your views on how do you solve the placebo effect for the other patients?
So I think the question was largely around the placebo portions of the trial and whether or not there's any solve for that from the regulatory perspective.
Yeah, it's a mix. So the issue with the placebo control is that you get a control group that you're comparing your drug against. And for the SMA study that we did, I think it was a one-year study. And in that 1 year, we clearly saw a difference in how patients that were treated with Spinraza differed from the placebo-treated patients. The first 6 months, actually in the type 2 study that we did, they tracked together. And so if we would have cut the study at 6 months, the drug would have failed because there was no difference. But after 6 months, they separated and the placebo patients declined and the drug-treated increased. So we could have gone forward without a placebo-controlled trial, but it probably would have taken 3 times longer to do the study because you really want to show that it's differentiating from the natural history of the disease. And there's, patients are biological, that there's, variation from one patient to the other. They all behave a little bit differently, and so you're never quite sure if what you're seeing is a drug effect versus a just natural variation in the disease. And if you were just to do natural history, we would probably just now be getting a point where we get a drug approved. And I think that's just the reality that we deal with, is that I don't really see a way out from under doing placebo-controlled trials without having the trials become very long and very expensive to do, and that's going to disincentivize companies from doing it.
I want to add, because there was no treatment available prior to this, so there were a lot of uncertainties. How long should the trials be conducted for? to hope to see an effect of the drug, and what should be the outcome measures, and was there more likelihood of success in type 1 SMA patients or type 2? And all these things are being discussed, but nobody knew the right answers. And so I think, at least retrospectively, the way the clinical trials were carried out was really successful. They were able to end the blinded portion a year ahead of schedule. And so I think, all things considered, this was the right decision. And so, yeah, 1/3 of the patients were on placebo for about a year before starting to receive the drug. So I don't think there's a better way. I think there was another question about the other diseases, and like you mentioned, myotonic dystrophy. So, I mean, there are different diseases, of course, but antisense oligos is a potential approach. Small molecules is a potential approach. So I recently attended, we don't work on myotonic dystrophy. I think Frank does, but I went to a meeting because they wanted to hear the example of SMA and how Spinraza was developed, to hear the whole story, because it might inspire different ways of doing things for myotonic dystrophy. So, meanwhile, when we have SMA meetings, years ago, but we sometimes invite experts to work on different diseases so we can learn lessons from those studies. And so there's definitely a lot of cross-fertilization fields working on different genetic diseases.
I was thinking, though, Frank, that there is a commitment by Ionis to even these N-of-1 type trials, which is the ultimate situation where you can't have a control population. I mean, that's a huge issue and complicated to measure the effect of the drugs.
Yeah,
Probably worth mentioning.
Yeah, so we have our ex-CEO started a foundation called the In Lorem Foundation that's developing therapies for individualized patients. So it's patients with sort of private mutations, that there's one patient in the world and maybe 10 patients in the world that have this mutation. So it's, from a commercial perspective, it's not going to be a commercially viable patient population to treat. But we have a technology that could help those patients. And so they're not really set up as clinical studies to show that the drug's benefiting them. It's a treatment. And we're doing our best trying to capture a little bit of clinical outcome. But the goal is just to provide a potential, and I use that word very carefully, a treatment for those patients. That's very different because there is no goal to get the drug approved and be able to market it and sell it. It's really, we're providing the drug free of cost to the patient and their families for that exercise.
What a wonderful commitment to patients. Thank you. We have another question over here, John.
I'd like to ask Asher's mom and dad how the two daughters reacted to all this.
I was actually going to mention that earlier with the shift that we've had is, so we have a 15-year-old and a 12-year-old. Asher has two older sisters, and it's been really hard, I think, on them, especially early on. When we entered into the clinical trial, it was a lot of juggling because there was all these different schedules of different evaluations that Asher had to undergo, and then even the procedure took a few days, and so we had to find community to help us, like watch the girls and take time off of work, and so there was like a lot of juggling, and there were, I felt like, a lot of years that activities were missed and momentum just really didn't happen because we were kind of focused on just like trying to get through this, whatever it was at the time. But I think we have a pretty open family, and so we talk a lot about that. And I think going to the conference every year, especially forcing my daughter, if she was on stage, she might tell you otherwise. But the first conference we went to, it was just our oldest daughter, and us, and I made her go to, they have a talk it out session for siblings, and I knew we would need support. I knew they would need support, and if there was a chance that she didn't want to talk to mom, but she would talk to some people that maybe could help her feel better, And so every year at conference, now she fights me because she's 15, but I'm like, no, you've been doing this, since you're 5, and I think it's worth it. And then meeting other families, we ended up extending our community with going to a camp that we go to in Oregon with a group of like 20 other SMA families, and I think connecting with other families and the children that are affected and their siblings has been really good for the girls. Even sometimes to vent. I've seen some text messages of some venting, which again, we know it's going to happen. We're not naive, and we wrote an article a long time ago, but just they don't see it because they're the kids. But we've tried to be intentional with try to do daddy-daughter dates, one-on-ones, and mommy-daughter dates, one-on-ones, and not that Asher is excluded from that. He gets his own dates and that, but having to be more intentional because we know so much is kind of zapped out of us with all the extra that comes along. And I think that happens with any family that's dealing with a medically complex child.
Yeah, I think a lot of the times they just feel like Asher's sisters. Oh, those are Asher's sisters. But today they're running the show back there. They're in the booth. So they're running this show.
Thank you, Brooke.
Over here.
Hi. I want to thank you, Autumn, bring all of you here in Autumn meeting. I'm so excited to see Andrea here. This is Jason Wen. It ring a bell to you? Who worked at Coastal Harbor about 10 years? Who actually did the deal in the sponsor research and exclusive license long time ago?
Yeah, let's talk. I can't see you, but I remember you, of course, so I'm glad you're here.
This is a great case in my career. Really, thank you, all of you, pushed it to the market finally. At that time, as I remember, Coastal Harbor Lab never have a real drug license deal. You are the first one, probably the biggest one, at least in my career. Frank, I apologize for my previous negotiation fighting with your team. Sorry about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know we're almost at time. I had a question for Ionis. Was there any incentives for you, since this was a common but a very rare disease, the most common rare disease, anything to do with the Orphan Drug Act or the fact you could get a priority review voucher, anything like that? Because I used to work for the Human Genome Research Institute. It was so hard to get commercial interest in rare and ultra-rare diseases, even if we had the science, even if we had a good drug. So I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, so although SMA is a rare disease still, it's probably 25 to 30,000 patients in the US. It's for a company like Ionis, it's at a size that's very attractive and manageable, from a corporate perspective. I think the pediatric voucher was probably not something that entered into the equation until pretty late in the process. It really wasn't a driver for doing the work that we did. It was really, we had a technology that we believed in, and we thought it would help patients, and that was really, the drive for going forward. As I mentioned, we are working a lot of other, even rare diseases where there's maybe 1,000 patients in the U.S. That becomes harder, but it's still something I'm personally committed to as a company. My goal is to, if we have a technology that can help people, to make it available to everybody that we can help.
That's awesome. Thank you. Well, I hope you have enjoyed this panel. I wanted to just make a few closing comments about the Better World Project. So the Better World Project has been around for a long, long time, and I think as an association, we've struggled a little bit with how to position those stories, and what to do with it, because we in this room are typically working on things way, way before they get to be worthy of being a Better World Project story write-up. The write-up is when our work is done, right? And when our work is done well and correctly. So I just wanted to thank everyone in the room who has one of the 550 plus successful stories in that project for working on them and for your continued commitment and courage to stay committed even when times get tough and rough. So thank you for that really hard work. And the Better World Project does have the story submission link. You'll find it on the Autumn website. To be a successful and accepted story, you need to show and demonstrate the partnership between academic research, a company, and the development of a product that's either in testing or on the market. So please, I encourage everyone to think about submitting stories to the project. And I wanted to say a special thanks to our panelists for having the courage and commitment as well to be here today. So with that, let's thank our panelists.